What they found buried in Göbekli Tepe's walls in 2026 changes everything. In the autumn of 2025, a team of archaeologists working under a protective steel roof in southeastern Turkey brushed away the last layer of soil between two ancient enclosures and stopped moving. Lying flat in the base of a wall, pressed horizontally into the foundation stones themselves, was a human figure carved from limestone. Not standing. Not seated in a niche the way the site's famous pillars stand. Lying down, buried on purpose, sealed into the architecture by people who had clearly meant for it to stay there. It was the first statue of its kind ever recovered at Göbekli Tepe, and it forced archaeologists to ask a question they thought they had already answered. What exactly was this place actually for? If you've never heard of Göbekli Tepe, here's the short version. It sits on a limestone ridge near the city of Sanliurfa in southeastern Turkey, and it is home to a series of massive circular enclosures built from T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing taller than a person and weighing many tons. The site dates back roughly 12,000 years, which places it firmly in the era before farming had spread across the region, before pottery, before the wheel, before writing of any kind. It predates Stonehenge by thousands of years and the pyramids of Egypt by even more. For most of human history, nobody knew it existed. Locals in the 20th century assumed the hill's scattered stones were nothing more than an abandoned medieval cemetery, and a 1963 survey noted the site, but moved on without grasping what lay beneath it. It wasn't until 1994, when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the ridge and recognized the tops of buried pillars poking through the soil, that anyone understood what they were standing on. What Schmidt uncovered over the following 2 decades rewrote a chapter of human history that many scholars considered settled. The standard story, the one taught in textbooks for most of the 20th century, went like this. Humans developed agriculture first. Agriculture produced surplus food. Surplus food allowed people to stop wandering and settle in one place, and only once people had permanent villages did they have the spare time, organization, and population density to build monuments and temples. Farming, then settlement, then religion. It's a clean, logical sequence, and it made intuitive sense. The problem is that Göbekli Tepe didn't fit it. The people who quarried, carved, moved, and erected these massive pillars were hunter-gatherers. There is no strong evidence of domesticated crops or livestock at the earliest phases of the site. And yet here was a monumental complex, carved with detailed images of foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, cranes, and vultures, built by people who, according to the old model, shouldn't have had the social organization to pull it off. Schmidt's own conclusion was blunt. He suspected that shared belief and communal ritual came first, and that the work of gathering people together to build something sacred might be what pushed them towards settled life, not the other way around. First the temple, he argued, then the city. That idea alone would have been enough to make Göbekli Tepe one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth. But the story didn't stop there, and the last few years in particular have added layers to it that Schmidt never lived to see. Let's go back to that statue found in 2025, because the details matter. It was uncovered between 2 of the site's excavated structures, known to archaeologists as enclosures B and D, during a restoration and excavation campaign led by Turkish archaeologist Necmi Karel, who has directed work at the site since Schmidt's death in 2014. The figure has a clearly defined head and torso, and its horizontal, embedded position in the wall's foundation is what makes it unusual. Most of the human imagery previously known from Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites has appeared as relief carvings on pillars or as smaller figurines, not as a freestanding statue deliberately built into a structural wall. Archaeologists working on the find have suggested it may represent some kind of ritual offering or a deliberate act of closing off a space, a way of marking a structure as finished, sealed, or transformed. That interpretation is reasonable, but it's still an interpretation. Nobody living today can ask the people who placed that statue what they meant by it. What we can say with confidence is that the placement was intentional. Nobody accidentally buries a carved human figure sideways in a wall's foundation. Someone planned that. This statue didn't appear out of nowhere. 2 years earlier, in the same general area between those enclosures, excavators found a life-sized wild boar statue, carved with enough detail that researchers could make out individual features of the animal's face and body. Similar human and animal statues have also turned up at Karahantepe, related site not far away, including a striking leopard sculpture and human figures carved in a style that clearly shares a common visual language with Göbekli Tepe. Taken together, these finds tell us that carved standalone statues, not just relief images on pillars, were part of how these communities express themselves, and that this tradition extended across more than one site and more than one generation. And that brings us to something that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Göbekli Tepe was never alone. For a long time it was treated, understandably, as a singular marvel, a lone flower blooming in the Stone Age, with nothing else quite like it nearby. That picture has changed dramatically. Turkish archaeologists now group Göbekli Tepe together with a cluster of related sites under a research initiative called the Taz Tepler Project, which translates roughly to Stone Hills. This includes Karahantepe, Sayburk, Bonkuklu Tarla, Sefertepe, and several other locations scattered across the region, all dating to roughly the same broad period, all sharing the T-shaped pillar tradition, and all carved with overlapping imagery of wild animals and abstract symbols. In November 2025, Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism marked the 5th anniversary of the Taz Tepler project by unveiling a new round of finds from across these sites, including additional human and animal statuary. The country's culture minister described the discoveries as evidence that these early communities had, in his words, a far more advanced level of consciousness in belief, ritual, and social organization than researchers previously assumed. That's not a fringe claim or a sensational headline. It's the position of the team that has spent the most time in the ground there. What does a network of related sites actually tell us? It tells us that whatever ideas were being expressed at Göbekli Tepe weren't the isolated invention of one small group. Communities separated by real distances were building with the same techniques, carving the same categories of animals, and apparently sharing enough contact or common culture to sustain that consistency over a very long stretch of time. That's a level of coordination and shared identity that most models of hunter-gatherer life in this period simply didn't predict. It doesn't mean these people had cities, writing, or anything resembling the civilizations that came thousands of years later. But it does mean they had something more organized, more connected, and more intentional than the old image of small, scattered, purely mobile bands living hand to mouth. There's another thread running through recent seasons of work at Göbekli Tepe that's just as important as any single statue: the growing evidence that people didn't only gather there for occasional rituals and then disperse. Excavations have identified structures with rectangular floor plans alongside the site's famous circular enclosures, and researchers have found domestic features consistent with daily living, things like storage areas and hearths, in parts of the broader site complex. This has fed an ongoing debate among archaeologists about whether Göbekli Tepe functioned purely as a ceremonial gathering place, visited seasonally by groups who lived elsewhere most of the year, or whether some portion of the population lived there on a more permanent basis, at least for extended stretches. Both interpretations have serious researchers behind them, and the honest answer, as of today, is that we don't have it fully settled. What we can say is that the picture has grown more complicated than the original temple built by wandering hunters who never stayed story that made headlines in the early 2000s. It increasingly looks like a place where ceremony, community, and daily life were tangled together in ways that don't map cleanly onto our modern categories of sacred site versus settlement. It's worth pausing here to talk about the climate these people were living through, because it puts the scale of their achievement in a different light. Göbekli Tepe's earliest construction phases date to the tail end of a period called the Younger Dryas, a sharp and well-documented cold snap that interrupted the general warming trend at the end of the last ice age. For roughly 1,000 years, temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped again after a period of warming, and the environment these communities depended on for food would have been unstable and, at times, harsh. Climate scientists and archaeologists have spent decades studying the Younger Dryas and its effects on the peoples of the Near East, and there is a serious body of research connecting climatic stress in this period to major shifts in how humans organize themselves, including the eventual emergence of agriculture in the same broader region not long after. I want to be careful here because it's tempting to turn this into a tidy, dramatic narrative. The idea that people built Göbekli Tepe specifically as some kind of desperate response to catastrophe. That's a compelling story, and you'll find versions of it across the internet, but it goes well beyond what the archaeological evidence can currently support. What we can responsibly say is that the people who built these monuments were living through a genuinely difficult and shifting climate, and that the will to gather, organize labor, and build something meant to last did not require an easy or stable world. If anything, that makes the accomplishment more impressive, not less, and it's a good reminder that human beings have a long history of building meaning and permanence precisely when the world around them feels uncertain. Now, about the carvings themselves, because this is where a lot of the more sensational claims online start to outrun the evidence, and it's worth being straightforward about that. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites are covered in detailed images. Foxes, snakes, boars, vultures, scorpions, cranes, and a range of abstract symbols that don't correspond to any animal or object we can easily identify. Researchers have spent years cataloging these images, and there is genuine, ongoing academic interest in whether certain animals or symbols cluster together in meaningful patterns, whether specific enclosures seem to emphasize particular themes, and whether any of the imagery might relate to seasonal cycles or celestial events the builders would have observed. These are legitimate research questions. But claims you may have seen elsewhere, that supercomputers have already decoded the carvings as a written language, or that specific pillars have been matched to star positions with near-perfect statistical precision, go considerably further than what has actually been published and verified by the archaeological community. Some of that content is speculative, and some of it is simply invented for views. The honest state of the research is more modest and, frankly, more interesting for exactly that reason. We know these images meant something important enough to carve into multi-ton stone blocks. We can see patterns in how certain animals and symbols recur, and we do not yet have a reliable way to read them the way we'd read a written language. That mystery hasn't been solved. It's still open. So, where does that leave us with everything uncovered so far? From the very first pillars Klaus Schmidt found in the 1990s to the statue pulled from a wall foundation in 2025? It leaves us with a site that keeps forcing revisions to the story every single excavation season. It leaves us with proof that hunter-gatherer societies, long before farming, before permanent villages as we usually imagine them, were capable of large-scale cooperative construction, sophisticated carved artwork, and a shared symbolic culture that spanned multiple communities across real distances. It leaves us with an ongoing, unresolved debate about whether people lived at Göbekli Tepe full-time or gathered there periodically, and increasingly serious evidence pointing towards some mixture of both. And it leaves us with the plain, almost hard-to-process fact that even after 3 decades of careful excavation, the vast majority of the site remains unexcavated and untouched, protected under the soil the same way it's been protected for 12,000 years. Turkish authorities aren't slowing down either. New visitor facilities at the site were completed heading into 2026 to handle growing public interest, and a major exhibition called Myths in Stone, Göbekli Tepe and the World of the Last Hunters opened at Berlin's James Simon Gallery in February 2026, bringing dozens of original artifacts from the Sanlierfa Museum to European audiences for the first time, following an earlier exhibition in Rome that drew millions of visitors. Excavation seasons continue year after year across the wider Taz Tepler network, and every single one of them, so far, has produced something that nobody expected. So, here's the honest question worth sitting with, and it's one archaeologists themselves are still asking. If people 12,000 years ago, living through a shifting and difficult climate, with no writing, no metal tools, and no domesticated animals to help them, chose to organize themselves around building something this permanent, something meant to outlast their own lifetimes, what does that tell us about what people actually need in hard times? Not just food and shelter, but meaning, memory, and a reason to gather. That's not a question science can fully answer with radar surveys or carbon dating. It's one we're left to think about ourselves. What do you think drove them to build it? Let me know down in the comments. And if you want to be here the next time this site forces us to rewrite what we thought we knew, make sure you're subscribed, because at the rate discoveries have been coming out of southeastern Turkey, the next surprise probably isn't far away.